welcome. Something happened in psychology that made the news as a headline.
It's not unusual.
Yes, but maybe it's an unusual way. Or let me put it this way: psychology made the news in a way that perhaps many psychologists would prefer didn't make the news. And in the New York Times, it says many psychology findings not as strong as claim. Study says.
Mm-hmm.
And the article goes on to highlight how a significant number of major psychological studies could not be replicated by a group of young researchers. And basically I want to know what you guys think. And perhaps my first question is there a crisis in psychological research? Does this indicate some sort of crisis in psychological research? So, whoever would like to talk, and maybe I'm Jeff Goldfab, the editor of Public Seminar, and maybe each of you introduce yourselves for the first time.
Sure. So I'm Jeremy Safran, a professor in the psychology department on the board of Public Seminar.
And then, okay, go ahead. Okay.
I'm Bill Hirst, also in the psychology department.
I'm Michele Miozzo, also in the Department of Psychology.
Okay, so it's three eminent psychologists that want to address my curiosity.
Do you want to say anything about our areas of expertise? Or?
No.
Okay.
We'll put that
Okay.
in writing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So what do you think?
Well, why don't one of you go first? I suspect I'll have the dissenting perspective on this, but maybe not.
Well, I mean, first of all, with respect to the Times article, it's important to point out that the committee that did this sort of organized these replication efforts emphasizes that this is probably not a problem just in psychology, but probably a problem in all sciences, if it's considered a problem. My own feeling is that there are some psychological effects which are very strong. There are that replicate fairly easily. There are some psychological effects which are more subtle and involve more, let's say, individual difference parameters than you would expect for other ones, certain other phenomena. And the failure to replicate could arise because of a lot of reasons. But what inevitably happens is that a lot of the discussion is, if you like, more synchronic than dichronic. It emphasizes that this particular experiment at this particular time doesn't replicate. What it doesn't see is that the field as a whole, if there is a continual replication failure, will essentially begin not to believe in this phenomenon. It's not that, and in a variety of, I can think of a variety of phenomena, such as there's something called priming, and there was a lot of research done in the 90s, which essentially shows things like if somebody reads an article about an old person, and then if you time the amount of time it takes them to walk down the hallway, they walk a lot slower than if they had read an article about the weather. So basically the notion was that the article about old people primed them to act like an old person and walk slowly. These results are very subtle. They're difficult to replicate. There's probably something there. It probably reflects something about our behavior. It is probably also the case that they were oversold in that they were framed as, in terms of big, large issues like free will. It indicated that we didn't have free will. We were controlled by all these sort of subtle effects which we were not aware of. And that was probably too strong a claim. So there's one is a narrow experiment, whether it replicates or not. My feeling is the field, after a while, realizes it doesn't replicate because it's just an interesting finding. People will try to replicate it. And although that doesn't, these replication failures have not, until recently, actually appeared in the literature, people talk, it's a community, it's not an individual that are doing things, and people begin to realize where they should put their money and in terms of further research. So there's the community aspect, there's the diachronic aspect, and these sorts of efforts in which they take one experiment, usually, and if you look at the ones that they try to replicate, they're pretty subtle types of phenomenon,
Right.
and then they essentially cast a sort of dispersion on the entire field, as Jeff indicated, that he walks away thinking there's something problematic about the field, whereas I think there's nothing problematic about the field. It's the way science works. The strong phenomenon will emerge and eventually get into your Introduction to Psychology textbook, and the weaker ones will never make it into the Introductory to Psychology textbook. And I think that's, once one views it as a more long-term process and a community effort process as opposed to an individual experiment standing alone, I think you probably see less of a problem than an article like the ones in the Times seems to present.
Actually, the number of articles in the Times were understanding. I don't think I think that they highlighted that there's some problem here. The psychologists are addressing it, and even published a piece that suggested this is actually all a part of normal science. As one area of my expertise is actually media, and I think that they were actually
I think they were, but I mean this individual effort I think is probably.
Well, it was a positive response also because many psychologists have been interviewed or took part in this debate.
Right.
But your question is what we think about these results. First of all, is there a failure to replicate? Well, we have to be careful in understanding the results of this paper, because one of the major outcomes is that there is variation with respect of the original findings. And this variation primarily pertain some important statistical aspects like effect size or the size of the probability associated with the strength of a certain result. Now we cannot conclude from this result that there is a complete failure to replicate. It's just telling us that the results tend to be weaker than what has been reported, consistently weaker, with many caveats that have been put in place. And so when you have a large study like this, about 100 studies that were attempted to replicate, you have also a very interesting, a large data pool that can guide you understanding what remediation could be taken, what could be some problematic aspects in this result. And in this respect, it was no news at all. We know that study with a very weak effect size are more problematic to be replicated.
Right.
We know that probably we are too keen to just reach the magic point of 5 significance level and not try our best to have more robust results that, as demonstrated in this study, tend to be more replicable. So these are just important lessons that we can get from this paper, but in essence are all things that we all know in the field, that we should try to have methods that are robust and give us effects that are particularly strong.
Okay, so I mean, I would say that the study, or rather the article in the New York Times reporting on the studies.
That was important science.
Yeah. Basically reporting on some of the efforts that were made to replicate studies on the heels of, people. I think a number of years ago, there's a cognitive psychologist, his name was Jonathan Schooler, who really came out and sort of made the case that some of the important effects that he got didn't replicate, and this is an important phenomenon. This has been a phenomenon that has been well known by psychologists for many years, so I don't really think that it throws the field into crisis, but I think it's important to understand some of the factors involved, and also to understand what fields you're more likely to find this in and what factors you're not. So,
What fields you're not?
Yeah. Okay, so first of all, speaking about psychology, since that's the field I know best, although I assume it generalizes some other fields, One of the issues is there is more of a premium on doing studies which are not replications, because those are the ones that are more likely to be published, right? If you publish a replication, there's less of a chance of it being accepted. If you publish a study where you get novel results, that's less likely to be accepted. So there are certain biases which lead in the direction of people submitting studies where they get positive results, and also which lead in the directions of studying studies which find the phenomenon which they are designed to find, which lead to their being accepted by journals. I think the other issue is that in terms of, I'm going to say replication, there's the recent issue of American Psychologist, which is sort of the premier journal of the American Psychological Association, was devoted to this issue because of these concerns. And I went through it pretty carefully, and in 2 or 3 of the articles, they speak about other fields in which you find the same phenomenon. It turns out that the major fields in which you find the same phenomenon are in the fields where you're studying the effectiveness of medications. Okay, well, I'm not surprised by that. When you're studying the effectiveness of medications, there's a huge premium on being able to demonstrate that a medication is effective. Okay, so you find, for example, when people are doing studies on the effectiveness of medications, first of all, that those studies which are funded by the pharmaceutical companies are much more likely to have positive results than those studies that are funded by sort of government funding bodies. Okay. In my field, which is psychotherapy research, we're well aware of this phenomenon. A number of years ago, there was a key article which demonstrated that when you're looking at what therapy is an effective therapy, it turns out that something like 70% of the variance is accounted for by the theoretical allegiance of the investigator. In other words, if you have a cognitive therapist comparing cognitive therapy to psychodynamic therapy, you're more likely to have the cognitive therapy coming out more effective. If you have a psychodynamic therapist being the principal investigator, you're more likely to have it come out the other way. Now, there are all sorts of reasons for this. There are both sort of conscious and more subtle reasons for it. First of all, if people have an investment in terms of demonstrating that, let's take it into the general world of psychology, that a certain phenomenon really does exist, then what they do is there's something called pilot testing, in which you sort of try to figure out how to set up the study and manipulate the variables so that you're more likely to be able to find the phenomenon you want to find. If you're not able to find the phenomenon you're looking for, then part of the process of doing a pilot study involves playing around with the different variables so that you can find a way of finding the phenomenon. So I think there's a way in which there is, I think any sort of science or social science, psychology is a human activity, and people have an investment. Psychologists, no scientists are completely objective in the sense they don't really care ultimately which way the results come out. People have an investment in demonstrating certain phenomena, so they really sort of try their hardest in order to be able to demonstrate that phenomenon. So I think that, combined with the other factors, does lead towards a kind of bias, so that even though Bill is right, in an ideal world, studies will be replicated again and again and again, and over time the findings which are strongest are the ones which will remain. there are factors in the field which reduce the probability of replications being conducted. There are factors in the field which reduce the probability of people submitting replications. There are factors in the field that reduce the possibility of journals publishing studies with replications. So I think for all of those reasons, I think that this replication problem really is a meaningful phenomenon, one that we need to consider seriously.
And cross-disciplinary, because it holds for all the disciplines.
I mean, the argument about people want to, the journals only publish results which are positive, that's that term, would hold for any field. I don't see.
Sure.
I'm not saying
look,
it's just
I want to be clear. I don't think that this is a horrible crisis in one of the disciplines at the New School for Social Research, only psychology.
But let me address the replication issue.
Okay.
There's two ways to address it. The first is that it's probably true, though some journals now are intentionally publishing replication failures or successive replications. And I reviewed several of them. I don't think it's a very good. I think it's a waste of pages. Nevertheless, I have reviewed them, and usually the criteria is that this is a finding that has had a major impact on the field. And so it's not a minor finding. They're not going to waste their pages on a minor finding, and that they have basically replicated it, truly replicated it in every little small detail. So there is a change in the major journals in the psychological sciences right now. There's a push toward so-called new statistics, where effect size and confidence intervals become more important than just merely getting a 0.05 significance. So these are small, but they're very small, sort of in the field sort of changes.
I mean, ultimately, you're not going to make your name by being very good at doing replication.
No, you're not going to make your name.
Well, I think that's one of the issues.
But here I want to talk about the replication issue. If an experiment does not replicate well, and people begin to know it, I am not going to have a student spend their time pursuing this phenomenon. Because what they're going to do is they're going to try to, because first you're going to have to get the phenomenon in order to understand what the rather more detailed parameters around that are. And if they can't get the basic phenomenon, they've wasted 3 years. So pretty soon this phenomenon, and people will say, you're wasting your graduate students' time, you'll be telling them about it, and pretty soon this will no longer appear. And you won't get a banner saying this fails to replicate. What it is as a phenomenon, it just slowly becomes something which people are no longer doing research on.
But the
field has whittled it out implicitly as opposed to explicitly.
When you talk about I just want to say, in terms of the field whittling it out, I think what you're leaving out is the fact that there are major forces which reduce the likelihood of replication studies being conducted, and major forces which reduce...
But if I'm understanding Bill correctly, what is involved is that I'm doing research that's built upon, not replicating, but built upon a phenomenon that has already been asserted. And in order for me to do my original research that's based on that previous research, if I can't replicate what they asserted was true, then my research falls apart. So it's kind of embedded in the discussion of science, of the scientific discussion, that you need to be able to build upon something. And
so I just
reviewed
something for a high-impact psychology journal, one of the major journals in the field, and which do publish replication studies. And this was a replication study, but it began with, I had my graduate students became interested in this, and for 2 years we tried to replicate this because we wanted to do some variation. We couldn't do the variation because we couldn't get the original phenomenon. So I'm going to tell you the struggle we had to replicate this.
And Bill's anecdote is common. Everyone in the lab had something like that.
And it becomes very widespread. But in this case, it was published. But it came from originally not an impetus. They weren't interested in replicating it because graduate student isn't going to get a job by replicating a study. They want to just take this phenomenon, which was of interest to the field, and try to understand it in more detail. But if the phenomenon wasn't going to replicate, they're not going to understand it in more detail. So, I mean, and people begin to know this, and they're going to say, you shouldn't waste your time doing this.
It's a question of how long it takes for people to get to know, given all the factors, which I think sort of reduce the probability of replication studies being conducted and published.
Yeah, but now we know, or we can have some intuition about the probability of replicating a study.
By
So
looking at
as
text
we
sizes.
are saying it again and again, it's time that we take this measure that we had for a long time into serious consideration.
So,
Now,
if I was going to summarize, you guys are saying it all works out in the end.
It all works out.
And you're saying, well, how long is that? How long does it take to all work out?
Look, I do think...
and especially in the case of pharmaceutical research, very big decisions can be made before.
Or there's a huge premium on being able
well,
to
that-
demonstrate.
we have to do.
I should say, a clinical psychologist would be more concerned about this, perhaps, than
I think that's
for
probably
the
true.
academic societies.
I think that's true, but I mean, there's a distinction between the finding
Yes.
and what you make of the finding.
Right.
And I agree with Jeremy completely that a pharmaceutical firm has forces at work which makes them want to make something of the findings. So my understanding is, for instance, for SSRIs, the second most prescribed drug class in the United States, very small effect sizes, if any, and very small effect sizes, which means basically that the evidence is hardly compelling that in the population as a whole, it makes a huge amount of
It
difference.
took a long time for the field to really begin to accept that, though.
Yeah, I don't think it completely accepts that now.
Yeah.
And it's partially because of these larger social forces, which makes this very difficult. And similarly, when I talked about this sort of
But it's
notion,
also
I talked
internal
about how I
forces.
always thought the priming literature oversold itself by making it about something like free will.
Right.
And there, I think, certainly there's policing going on. Maybe the pharmaceutical companies are so powerful they can squash dissent. But certainly a lot of people objected to the sort of blown up rhetoric of the priming effects even before they began to question the effect size of the priming effects.
I would like to go back to the issue of replicability, that your original question. Most likely, some of the failures to have the same power as in the original experiments might reflect original features in the studies. But I would like also to highlight another aspect, that these studies were all thought to be replicable. And this perhaps a strong bias, not a false bias, that we might have in the field of psychology. We all, most of all of us, work under the assumption that what we discover are general, universal, and therefore replicable phenological processes. These might be obvious, perhaps, or less problematic as a claim in the domain like color perception or textual perception. But, to make this claim about biases or even memory studies might be quite a strong assumption, because there could be a lot of cultural variability. And so the issue that these studies can be replicable perhaps reflect our lack of understanding of many variables that can determine whether a study lead to certain
But I would call that a lack of replicability.
It is a lack.
I would call that an exploration of the phenomenon, which you begin to understand the parameters which
I was going
affect
to go
that.
there. Technically, here was considered to be a lack of replicability or a study that demonstrated a different effect size. In reality, it reflects, as you pointed out, a lack of our understanding, a lack of our of the articulation of our theory, that we have really really no good ways to understand the impact of cultural or many other factors.
So, you know, I look at psychological research as an outsider. And as an outsider, I'm looking for interesting things, you know, that could then inform my life or inform my sociology and my politics. And you're suggesting that it's exactly that move from inside the kind of internal discourse of a scientific enterprise to try to use that discourse to think of kind of larger implications that the problem lies unless we share with each other an understanding that a lot of the research should be viewed as being exploratory to highlighting the dimensions of psychological problems, not necessarily demonstrating psychological effects. But, you know, I have to say I'm saying that because I'm thinking about scandals in my own discipline having to do with the problems of ethnography, and people wanting ethnography to have as hard, you know, to be as firm a ground as experimental research, and wanting it to be replicable, and it's not very replicable, and you know, sometimes very big scandals. But it seems to me that actually, if we understand this type of inquiry as being, and I don't care if it's called scientific or not, but inquiry as being an inquiry into the dimensions of problems, the types of relationships that one can observe under certain conditions, then I'm personally more comfortable with it. If you don't like this resolution.
Well, I was just wanting to pick up on a couple of things you said. Okay, so number one, in psychology, there's a very, very strong emphasis in what traditionally was referred to as the justification aspect of science. That is hypothesis testing, okay? So that's somewhat different than the natural sciences, where hypothesis testing plays an important role, but that's only one part of it. So I think this very strong emphasis on hypothesis testing as being the essence of the science of psychology is something which is somewhat problematic, because it leads in the direction of exclusively doing studies which are designed to test hypotheses, but which are really designed to demonstrate phenomena. Number two, when you talk about being interested in studies which demonstrate interesting phenomena, well, those are the studies which are most likely to get attention, right? And so it's not just the phenomenon which you're demonstrating, but it's the particular way in which you demonstrate it and the way in which it's written up. So, for example, recently we were having some discussion of Stanley Milgram's research, which was conducted in the 1960s, where he demonstrated that you know, people in a situation where the scientist tells them to shock somebody as a way of testing their ability to influence their learning, where the normal person will go much further than we would anticipate. That study was incredibly controversial. It had a huge impact, but one of the reasons it had an impact was not just because of the fact that it demonstrated something that we already knew, or, I mean, perhaps people were unclear about that, but it was just such a potent demonstration of a phenomenon that people paid attention to it. So I think there is a premium in terms of doing studies which demonstrate phenomena in a very kind of vivid way, and there's a greater likelihood that studies of that sort will get cited and have an impact.
And in fact, for the people perhaps who didn't read this paper, we can point out that one of the factors that correlate with weaker P's or weaker effect size is the factor that they call surprisiness. So they rated how surprised this finding was, and this correlated with the lack of the weaker effect. and is a real risk that we have in the field. That
Right.
we are
So the
after something
really,
that
it's the
is,
rhetorically attractive
That's right.
piece is also the most vulnerable in terms
Not
of
always,
this.
but often.
You know, or it's associated. with it.
which
Not-
my
not-
review.
Yeah,
not-
the Milgram study replicates quite well.
Yeah, no, it's a tricky issue
And
because
the Milgram study, to be clear, I mean, Stanley did this because it was after World War II,
Yeah.
and I mean, but for the audience, it was after World War II, and a part of the discourse, public discourse at the time was, those are the Germans that respond to authority, and we don't
Right.
respond to
no, that was a
authority.
powerful study.
And he wanted to say, no, we're all equally susceptible to authority. So, I mean, it was undertaken to have a large public
Yes.
impact, and it did.
Right, so I think what I really want to sort of highlight here is the sort of the rhetorical aspect of the research enterprise. It's just important to really sort of keep that in mind. It's not just a matter of does a study replicate or not. It's that any study is part of an ongoing conversation, and the way in which the study is written up and presented and used is part of a rhetorical process and plays a role in a, quotes, scientific conversation. So in the final analysis, it's not just a matter of will science in the final analysis weed out those effects which are powerful and which ones aren't, but rather how does the conversation take place among scientists over
Well, it's
time?
not just among scientists. If you're talking about the larger public impact, it's the journalists. And they do glom onto the Button-Seller newspaper.
Yeah, but we feed the news,
Yeah.
and we are so happy that
Well, of course we're
many
happy.
times
It could be
these,
a career.
these
Yeah,
results are
exactly.
mischaracterized,
No, no,
or
but
whatever
it's
happened
not
in
only,
there.
it's not only the newspapers that address a general public, but it's also interdisciplinary interaction. Because you know, if we're smart, we actually learn from other disciplines because these disciplines are disciplines, so it helps us discipline our inquiry and we can move forward, but it also blinds us to things. So it makes sense to pay attention to what is happening in other disciplines.
Okay, so let's take a phenomenon.
But then this problem
Well, I mean,
appears.
Cass Sunstein had a article in the Times, I think on Sunday or sometime around that. I read on the internet, so I don't know exactly
Right.
what day it was. Basically, it was an argument of applying behavioral sciences to government, and you know how to fill out, how to design a form that people will
Yes,
actually
right,
be able to
sure.
understand and fill out. And for someone like Cass Sunstein, a big issue, of course, is nudging, which comes directly out of Danny Kahneman and Tversky's work, which not only had an impact larger, it had an impact on economics and,
Yes,
and
right.
probably sociology, a lot
Yes,
of fields. And so here was work. I'm sure there must be one or two replication failures of some of his phenomena out there, but they're pretty robust.
Yeah.
And not everybody uses, and he talks about heuristics, so not everybody uses the availability heuristic, not everybody uses the various heuristics, but there is a tendency for people to use them, and it leads to certain, if you like, irrational decisions. And that has an impact. And one of the applications is that you can, by recognizing that people are influenced by these sorts of things, you can nudge them in ways which are more socially productive.
Or also socially problematic.
Whichever way you want to,
Right.
but they say socially
There's
productive.
a connection between this and the
Well, my point
replication.
is, Jeff said that one of the problems is that maybe we should keep this all an infield discussion, and maybe we should sort of be more cautious in moving things to other fields.
No.
And-
I'm just pointing out that the problem is manifested when you move outside.
Yes,
But
but there are
not-
still,
not-
but it means that, but there are some phenomena which are robust enough, which the
Yes,
field
yes.
has converged upon,
I'm in
which
favor of
other
it.
people should.
And the argument can be made in the other direction as well. You know, when it comes, for example, to doing research on the treatment of cancer, the argument is made that we shouldn't wait as long as we do before we give FDA approval towards a drug which is considered to be in the experimental phases. So the argument can be made in the other direction.
In fact, one can even fantasize or make this argument that the weak effect that we find and are really surprising is a sign of maturity of a field, because the important effects, the major effects, have been discovered already.
I don't think we have to worry about that.
One
That
could
was a
say
paradoxical argument.
one could say
have to worry
But there is something ironical for me in this discussion, because if you think, about 10, 15 years ago, there was a mushrooming of various scientific journals or outlets that use the internet.
Right.
And it seems, that this was a free, cheap way that the scientific community can use to disseminate important findings,
Right.
including those that failure or replicate that are so important and vital for our.
You don't have to go back to our earlier discussion. You don't have to worry about wasting paper.
Yeah.
But
it's ironical that we do not have many sites or many group of scientists who had initiative where everyone can essentially put all the failures to replicate.
Mm-hmm.
And this would be a very vital and important initiative.
Yes.
That, and cheap, probably, but it's not.
But there's a question of where the initiative for doing that would come from.
There are.
Well, it's a question of alerting the community that there is this possibility, and a little bit of peer reviewing, or be sure that some standards are met. But it's interesting that this has not been massively exploited as an opportunity that is there.
No, but what I'm saying is that there is less incentive for a researcher to put their energy into.
No. He's
All
saying
the failures
that
of
along the way,
replication.
I'm trying to do a study. I'm having trouble replicating based on a previous study. I'm having trouble replicating it. So just have a site where you record.
Oh, I see. So you don't have to worry about whether or not it's published in the mainstream journal.
It's kind of a data bank.
Yeah.
To circumvent exactly the problem that we all cited about publishing negative findings or failure to replicate.
So I was thinking.
There are there are places where you can register the experiment that you do. So when you begin an experiment, you register that experiment, and then you report the results of those experiments at the end, along with the archiving of your database, whatever the nature is. And those sites exist, and funding agencies are more and more inclined to force you to utilize them.
Right. That's interesting.
But they're not publications, they're sort of archival databases.
So the issue would simply be to have such archives.
But who's ever going to look at them?
It's also, again, there are
because
many.
It's the same No, actually looking at them would solve the problem, or some version of it. But then this goes back to your point. Given the amount of attention that I have, the amount of time in the day, how much time am I going to spend looking at failed experiments when my project is, I need to do original research.
Yeah, you are going to look at it
based on
but
public.
But you
public
are going
material.
to look at it if you're trying to replicate this thing and you fail, and you say, is this because I'm an idiot or somebody else is also having this problem?
But there are also easy way to pay attention to that is to make a link between this data bank and the original paper in the journal.
Right.
So
I assume there is such a link, but
No,
you still have to want to look it up.
Yes.
You still want to have to look it up.
So actually making visible these attempts would, or knowing a place where you could see this.
Yeah, Google Scholar could make a link, which would make it much more useful.
There are
That would be
many
interesting.
potential solutions to the problem. The question is how many of these solutions are likely to be implemented. For example, people have argued for a long time that there should be an insistence that funding agencies have or journals have that people basically make their hypotheses public before they collect the data. So that at that point we know in advance what the hypotheses are.
Right.
What is the likelihood of this ever really being implemented?
Right. There's a disincentive to do
Right.
that.
Yeah.
I
So-
also
so
think
I-
that there's
yeah, I'm
something
remembering-
destructive about that.
Well, I'm remembering,
Because I think it views the scientific processes. Again, you criticize hypothesis testing, and it makes it too mechanical. Because often what happens is you don't get the findings that you want,
but you see
but it suddenly reveals something about the phenomenon,
Right.
which was very interesting.
Right.
Do you then say I failed?
Well,
no,
no,
I don't think you
no,
failed.
that's a very
I think
good point.
you got an insight.
Well,
But the problem is, I think, trying to understand, being sympathetic to Jeremy's point, is that then the material tends to be presented as if there were a hypothesis that you've tested.
Yes,
Yeah,
because
that,
the
so-
journal
so-
requires that.
Right.
Right.
So it kind of distorts.
But sorry, Jeff.
So this is, I think, like some of the more interesting findings come out of a discovery process
Right.
in which you don't end up demonstrating phenomenon you initially
Thought,
wanted to
right.
demonstrate, so you start playing with the
You
data
play-
until
right.
you find things you hadn't anticipated.
Right.
And usually then you follow them up with several other experiments to
Right.
try to nail down.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that in making all of the decision, you have no idea if it is a failure to replicate, if it is, you know, a result that you would get if you try a second time
Yeah.
or a third
Yeah.
time.
Well-
And we go back to the point that is, at this point in our field, like presumably in every other field,
No, I
it's
think
very
it is.
difficult
I
to
think-
test these probabilities.
I think an awful lot
if
of
the
this-
universe of probabilities is
Well,
out
part
our
of the
control.
the one problem
And it's
that we
fine.
have, that a lot of people discuss, the one problem that a lot of people discuss, which we haven't mentioned yet, is there a tendency now toward journals to take single study papers. And I mean, there are some, for a long time, journals you have to have 5 or 6 or 7 experiments to get published. Nowadays, in journals like Psych Science, 1 or 2 studies and if they find it interesting, you're in. I would expect that replication failures are probably higher for studies in Psych Science than they are in other studies because you don't have this huge. I mean, basically, what you've asked is somebody spend 2 or 3 years of doing studies in order to get this one paper published. Right. And the field is, the professional field is less tolerant of that, and the journal publication industry has responded to it by having these very short papers, which I think leads to probably greater replication, small effect size sorts of things. But these journals also are becoming more and more sensitive to effect size than they were in the past.
I think one of the questions, just to sort of shift back to something we originally discussed, is this a problem which is limited to psychology, or does it take place in other fields as well? And if so, in what fields? Okay, so again, this latest issue of American Psychologists, where they speak about other fields in which there's this problem with replication, I looked up the citations, and they were all studies on the effectiveness of medications. So, for example, do either of you know, in terms of, let's say, physics, for example, which is always spoken about as the sort of ultimate natural sciences, is failure to replicate a consistent problem? Do people have data on that in physics and
I don't know. You have to
biology?
divide physics up because if you're doing an experiment which requires you to observe something billions of light years away, you have one shot chance of doing that.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of those big mega projects are one shot chances. I do know when you read them, they talk about how iffy the data is, how there's multiple ways to slice the pie, and it really becomes a field consensus on whether to believe it or not.
Yeah.
So it's not a replication failure, it's more like how do you go about doing it.
So I'm thinking that these problems in psychology and in other disciplines have to do with as much with representation of the field and strengths and weaknesses of the implicit philosophy of science that kind of underlies the way it's represented. So that an awful, I think that ethnographers make a mistake by purporting that they went out and observed the world, and anyone going out and observing the world is going to see the same thing. But I don't think that means, therefore, that ethnography is not a way of knowing. So there's a need to actually match the the strengths, but also the limitations of a methodology in order to actually develop
physics. I would like to go back to physics because it presents a very interesting example. Nowadays in physics, you have the opportunity to measure events that are reliable, replicable, but incredibly rare. I mean, the whole CERN in Geneva has been built to discover events that are exactly. But this maybe is a sign of maturity of maturity of that field, because they have a precise theory that, despite the small effect size, if you want.
Well, you see, there the issue is you're able to make very elaborate and complex predictions, on the basis of mathematical modeling, etc., etc. So I think in that kind of situation,
but for instance, the CERN stuff, as I understand when I read it and I read the discussions about it, you do not directly see that particular molecule doing that particular thing. They are making assumptions about it, and then, of course, within the field, there are people who question those assumptions.
Well, not as much probably in other fields, but it's exactly the same kind of inference that we make. We don't see the mind, but we make a bunch of inferences about the mind or culture.
Right. I mean, in the cognitive neuroscience field, Vols published that article quite a few years ago, which said, this whole field is tentative, even though it seems to be very high tech.
But it also points out that there are some disciplines that are relatively young, and there is still a lot of accumulation of knowledge that we have to reach in order to.
I don't know if youth and maturity is necessarily the best metaphor, because people have been asking philosophical questions for a very long time. It's a very mature discipline.
Very mature.
But interestingly enough, is still surviving.
And actually, it is interesting. So why is it that in some areas of human inquiry that we are satisfied that all we have are questions and tentative answers, and there's very little accumulation?
I think it has to do with claims to expertise is the issue. I think in certain fields there is a real premium on being able to claim a certain kind of expertise. So in psychology there is a real value to being able to argue that, well, psychologists do have an expertise and that's meaningful. So I think the issue is that the argument which is often made is that it's a pre-paradigmatic discipline, it's still quite young, and eventually as it matures, things are going to change. I'm not so sure that's the case.
Well,
I'm totally sure, just to finish this, when you look at, for example, cognitive neuroscience, I mean, it's something that didn't exist in its form even 15 years ago, so it's very young. Out of question, is a baby.
Well, but the questions that they're asking, Jeff's right, are still the same. I mean, cognitive neuroscience was born to a large extent because technology
It's a new technology. Sure. And then there are major issues there in the cognitive neurosciences in terms of the way in which the data are interpreted and represented, etc., etc.
But let me ask to address it. One of the things why I'm concerned about this public discussion about replication failures and the like is because I think that there's a larger political agenda. I think both on the right and on the left, there's a deep distrust of what I'll call empirical social science. And that this feeds into that distrust, both in the right and the left. And at some level, I chastise my colleagues in the field that run around making these statements about replication failures and the like, because I think they're deeply doing a disservice to the field, and that they're feeding into the kind of discourse that exists both on the left and the right, which would prefer to do away with these empirical investigations and their claim to expertise and their claim of knowing and the like. The claim of expertise and knowing is more an argument from the left. A claim of, that this is not real science is the argument on the right. But my own feeling is, and what I've been trying to say is that we're proceeding as almost any other science. We have, and like any other science, what is on the cutting edge has a tentative quality to it.
I think the one thing I would add is that the sort of like term science is a very, very sort of complicated term, and there's a whole demarcation debate, when is something a science and when is something a not science, okay? And I think psychologists have a big investment in calling themselves scientists, but they're not scientists in the same sense that people in the natural sciences are scientists, and I think it's important to acknowledge that.
How so, Jeremy?
Yeah.
Tell me how I'm not the same kind of scientist as a scientist in the
Because
natural sciences.
the phenomena which you are investigating are not as predictable. I think the phenomena are not as strong. I think the phenomena are somewhat more complex. I think there are differences between investigating psychological phenomena and physics and biology.
So you never talk about methodology, you just talk about phenomena.
I don't.
What usually was meant when one talks about science is one talks about method.
Yeah.
Not the phenomenon one studies, but the method in which one goes about trying to.
But what makes psychology...
You talk about theories and the opportunity that you have on making a prediction that can...
Well, that's the methodology. That's the methodology.
One of the issues in psychology...
It's the way in which you develop theories.
A literary scholar can be very interested in human nature, but they don't go about studying human nature by developing hypotheses, doing results in which the community as a whole accepts that result. They're interested in using, let's say, a novelist to sort of appeal to people about a way of people live. And that's an excellent way of proceeding. It's not the scientific method, and nor would they ever make a claim that it's a scientific method. You could argue what kind of methodology falls under it. But basically, although people think we may be naive in this respect, we do think that we're arriving at, quote, some sort of objective evidence that within the community they agree to. And this gets us far away from the replicability issue. But, method is very much part of what science is about.
So I think that the issue is about how we come about knowing, and the line we draw between a more scientific way of knowing and, let's say, a more humanistic way of knowing.
What Jerry Bruner called paradigmatic versus narrative modes of thinking.
Okay. And I think that disciplines, and psychology is included, but sociology even more so, straddle that distinction, and individuals, as they're trying to know the world, invest more or less on each side of the divide.
Right, but the replication issue focuses narrowly on those psychologists who have adopted this sort of experimental scientific methodology.
Absolutely, and how steady it is on its own terms is actually an issue, and I think you're right, that there are people who want to explain away a way of knowing, a more scientific way of knowing, and they jump on this and impute too much into it. But on the other hand, there are people who have a great deal invested in knowing scientifically as opposed to knowing humanistically.
Yes.
And they will be hyper sensitive and assert that no problem here.
Right, there are people who have
so I'm actually interested. I think that we've probably gone. We've kind of covered the field. I'm interested in exploring this more fully later on. On public seminar, I'm particularly interested in speaking to colleagues in other fields, not about psychology, but about the same problems in other fields. So as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking about the controversies, particularly revolving around Alice Goffman's research in Philadelphia, sociologist, where she's asserted to be doing many unethical things, and people are defending her for doing.
What is she doing?
She studied essentially a gang in Philadelphia, and some people claim that she went off. She went to the other side, and then the issue of the fundamental problem of the sign. What is your relationship with the natives that you're studying?
Yeah.
And is there a stance that you can take apart from your subject's position? Do we have a superior scientific position? And there's really a lot of debate about that. So I'm really quite curious about how this apparent scandal in psychology illuminates not only the issues in psychology, which you described in a very interesting way here, but in other disciplines as well. So naturally, because of the desire to think of psychology as being scientific, in our discussions here, we've been referring to, in quotes, the harder sciences. But I'm curious, for another debate, what is the relationship between this issue, relationship between this controversy as it exists in psychology and normal science in the other social sciences. So thank you very much. I think this was an interesting discussion. I hope you're satisfied that you said that you got to say what you wanted to say, and do you think that we covered the right issues? Is there anything that...
I think we did.
Yeah? Sure. Yeah, okay, good. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Jeff.
Okay, so we'll see what we can come up with.
Thank you.
Expectations coming here, so
I
had no expectations, so what we said is fine.
I certainly did.
Yeah, you thought I was going to...
No, not you. I mean, Jeremy said what I thought Jeremy was going to say.
Well, you said what I thought you were going to say.
Exactly. Exactly.
And the whole point was to let the rest of the world know about this dialogue.
Yeah, cool. Thank you very much for that.
Okay, thank you.